Why is the supposedly uninhabited island of dogs surrounded by an electrified fence which protects miles of rail tracks and concrete barracks? Those who venture to this island are confronted with warnings to leave and a shower of gunfire. Who controls this island, and what is their purpose? Only the Phantom can successfully penetrate its deadly mystery. The Story of the Phantom, Volume 13. The Island of Dogs.
Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade, all adventure lovers and Phantom fans. For those who came in late, I've been reading and reviewing all the Hermes Press reprints of the 15 1970s Avon paperback novels based on original Lee Falk newspaper strip tales of the iconic Ghost Who Walks, the Phantom. These were all done as part of the sort of emerging craze and popularity of men's adventure paperbacks and are all slightly expanded versions of original Phantom newspaper stories. Now, Lee Falk himself wrote several volumes, but the others were handled by different writers. Most of them were done by Ron Goulart under a pseudonym, but a few were just done by a single author. So this was actually written by Warren Shanahan, who just wrote this one book. This is based on the Lee Falk tale of the same name from the Phantom newspaper strip, and is, you know, it's very much a sort of, well, it's very James Bondian. It very much has the flavor of sort of Dr. No, because you essentially have revealed to be a villain having a secret base on an island, and with some sort of threat to the world planned that has been carried out and built up in secret. But the setup of the actual Isle of Dogs, because that is the name itself, is probably, I think, the most fascinating aspect of this book, because the name comes from the history of the island, which was originally actually populated by some dogs that were left stranded there and who actually managed to survive and grow into a pack of all kinds of different stray dogs that actually became sort of, over time, wild, violent, and feral. So you actually had an island full of vicious, wild dogs of all kinds of different types that somehow managed to survive. So that meant most locals kind of steered clear of the place, and that it always had this sort of notorious aspect tied to it. That is actually gone into great detail in the opening section of the book and is wonderfully atmospheric and fascinating. And then it becomes rather obvious that now someone or some presence is on the island and up to no good, because they not only allow no trespassing, but actually shoot at and kill locals who go anywhere near the place. This sends certain locals with apparently nothing better to do on a sort of detective mission of sorts, and the Phantom has to intervene because they're very much in over their head, and the Phantom uncovers the actual plot, which has rather world-shaking connotations once it's revealed. This is very much a sort of typical Bondian type idea. You will definitely think of Dr. No when reading this story, and it's nice that this has all been done in terms of the story and the plot. It's all been handled, pretty much in broad daylight in terms of it's. The island was purchased legally, and these local people were even hired to carry out some of the construction of the actual villain base, but, they didn't necessarily question what they were doing. So it's the sort of accoutrements of the story and how it's fleshed out that are the most fascinating, because the actual plot is rather straightforward. And again, this being one of the Avon books written by another writer, especially somebody who just wrote this one, you can clearly tell this is based on a serialized newspaper strip story that had to have the story very simplistic, so it could be told in a few panels per day, and it would be able for somebody to just pick up at any point in the story and jump in and know where you were going. That's something you run into with a lot of these Avon novels. It did help some that certain volumes were actually combinations of pre-existing stories from these strips instead of just a single story arc, because that did help to be able to sort of flesh out the story more, to have more material to have a novel. in terms of the length. All of these you can pretty much read rather quickly, sometimes in one sitting, and this is one of the slimmer volumes. I also think that certain writers had a better handle on doing this particular type of adaptation work of taking a newspaper strip story and trying to turn it into book form. So I think because this is just a single straightforward adventure and it is very much a sort of Dr. No type plot, and it is rather Bondian, it is rather straightforward, and there's not a lot of development outside of those elements. I think this is one of the weakest of the Avon Phantoms, also because the writing isn't as fully engaging as all the other volumes up to this point. So I think this is still a solid adventure, but I think it's one of the ones where you can clearly tell it is basically adapting a pre-existing source, and I don't think the writing is as good as all the other writers, and it's also unfair to compare any of these to the ones Lee Falk wrote, because there you have the primary writer and the original creator of the Phantom, so it's an unfair comparison. Still, this is a very quick, very fun read. It's got a lot of nice action, and I really do like the setup and depiction of the villain, and we get some actual villain backstory and internal monologue, so he's a bit more three-dimensional, but I mean, it's not really giving it away because you can tell that it's a particular type of character, but our villain here is essentially a Russian military officer of higher rank who is carrying out a secret act, basically creating a sort of secret missile base on this island for nefarious purposes. And it's nice to have at least a sense of atmosphere of the world around the story, and it does help because the story is so simplistic and the page count is rather low that you can read this straight through, and we do need those little bits of atmosphere to at least make things a bit more interesting, because you can tell where the story is headed in terms of the direction rather quickly on, because it is very much, seemingly inspired by stories like Dr. No. So I would say this is, overall, this is probably my next to lowest ranked in the Avon Phantom books. I enjoy all 15 of them, but I do think the Lee Falk written ones are sort of at the top by default, because, it's hard to compete against the series creator. And here in this one, and I think particularly in books 13 and 14 of the Avon Phantom novels, each was written by a single author who only wrote that one particular volume, and I think that makes them kind of stand out a little bit as being the least effective of these adaptations of Phantom strip stories. But it's still a good, solid read. You get a fun, pulpy adventure that has enough energy to keep the reader entertained, and if you're going to read the Avon Phantom novels, you're going to want to read all of them. So it's great that you have the ability to pick up these lovely Hermes Press reprints, which I have here. As I've gone over, these all have matching designs in a nice, more premium, oversized format, nice matching spines, and then the matching rear with the original blurb. These do replicate the original beautiful George Wilson covers, which are very pulpy and were, of course, meant to sell 70s paperbacks to readers of men's adventure series. Now, I do actually have the original. This is the only original Avon copy I have, so you can see this is just expanded upon in size to give it a more premium flavor. The only thing I will say, I guess these were, the Hermes reprints were photocopies or copies of the original artwork. But here, since this is the one I have, I think you can tell very clearly that the actual art is a little softer on the reprint because it is copied and it's also expanded to the bigger form. So if you do have an original copy of an Avon novel, they will be a little bolder and a little sharper because this is obviously the original printing. And the reprint, by going for the expanded size, they did have to, basically, blow up the artwork a little bit. So it is a little bit softer, and you can tell it was obviously duplicated from another source. It still looks good, but when you have the original to compare with, you can tell the original is obviously a bit sharper. So here again is the Hermes reprint, which has the nice feel in the hand because it is the more premium size. We open to find the beautiful essay, Everything is Possible with the Phantom Except Boredom. That is replicated from the original, and it's a beautiful essay. But then we also have the iconic prologue for those who came in late, talking about the origin of the Phantom, which is also replicated from the original Avon copy. And then we have the lovely new text block layout, which is nice, very easy to read, and part of what makes these Hermes Press reprints so nice to have. It's also great to have these because the original copies are very collectible. They were never reprinted before these, and so they are very expensive on the used market and rather tough to track down a complete set. So you'll wind up spending probably more for original copies of all 15 than you would for all 15 reprints. Now, the one downside of these is that some of them do have a number of typos. They are thankfully very minor, but it's a little bit frustrating. But unfortunately, you kind of run into that with a lot of independent publishers. But thankfully with these, they are mostly minor, and they do kind of happen a bit. They're really more in the later volumes, but they never really distract from the reading. You can very much tell what they were supposed to be, but do keep in mind you will probably run into at least a small typo or two in a lot of the later Hermes reprints of the Avon books. So all in all, while this is a slimmer Phantom novel in the Avon series at just over 120 pages, and it's a more straightforward, very Bondian type adventure, if you like your Phantom tales to have more of a James Bond flavor, or if you like pulp stories that feel kind of like a smaller scale Bond film, then you really will enjoy The Island of Dogs. It's still a fun read, it's an engaging read, but and I would recommend all the Avon Phantom novels. If you enjoy one of them, you'll enjoy all of them. But I do think 13 and 14 in this series being written by a single writer who just wrote that one volume, I do think both of them are not as well written as the others, and they are much more straightforward, so I would kind of, if I had to rank these in terms of enjoyment and effectiveness, I would put these two at the bottom. I would put this one just above 14, but it's still a good, fun read, and obviously based on the original Lee Falk story, so that sort of keeps it on point, and the atmosphere is great. The characterizations are nice and expanded upon from the original story, but I just love the setup. And the actual story of the Island of Dogs is actually the most fascinating part of the book, so at least there's a good setup and a good fun adventure and some nice Phantom moments, but I do think this is, it's a slimmer volume and a straightforward adventure, so it kind of is what it is, and you can just go along for the ride and enjoy the adventure. So those are my overall thoughts on the Hermes Press reprint of Book 13 of the Avon Phantom novels, The Island of Dogs. It's a fun, straightforward adventure, but probably on the lesser side of these because of the one-time author and it being just a straightforward adventure and being very much like very much like Dr. No, actually, in particular. So I think you can recognize those elements and still have a lot of fun with this. It's always nice to have a fun, pulpy adventure from time to time to get some more excitement in your reading life, if you will. But of the Avon Phantoms, this is definitely on the weaker side, and I just don't think it quite stacks up to some of the other books. But again, if you read and enjoy any of the Avon Phantoms, I would recommend picking up all 15, because they all have their moments, even if it's one of these that I don't think is quite as good as the others. So as always, I do hope my thoughts, musings, and babblings on all the adventures of the iconic Ghost Who Walks, the Phantom, have been at least somewhat fun and informative. I will leave a link to Hermes' website should you be interested in picking up a copy of the reprint. And as always, please do keep reading print books, keep enjoying adventure stories, and happy phantoming. Thank you ever so much for watching.